Welcome back. So, in the last video, we talked about the mechanism of action of the stimulant ADHD medications. In this one, we're going to focus on the non-stimulants. But a lot of what you learnt in the first video will remain very relevant for this one. Let's start with atomoxetine. It's shown as the purple triangle on the top left of the diagram. Atomoxetine is a specific blocker of the noradrenaline transporter. It has very poor binding to and therefore very little effect on the dopamine transporter. However, if we remember that in the prefrontal cortex, most of the dopamine is actually taken up by the noradrenergic transporter, we'll understand why in this region atomoxetine actually increases both noradrenaline and dopamine. It's therefore important to recognize that atomoxetine is not simply a noradrenergic drug. The big difference, however, between atomoxetine and the stimulants is that in brain regions where there are no noradrenaline transporters, atomoxetine will have no effect. One such region is the nucleus accumbens. This is the so-called pleasure center of the brain, and it's the site implicated in drug highs and drug addiction. And this is why atomoxetine is not associated with a potential for substance misuse. Lastly, let's think about guanfacine and clonidine. Here, they're the pink ovals just to the left of center. They both have a very similar mechanism of action to each other and very different from the other medications we've talked about. They are alpha-2 adrenoreceptor agonists and work by directly stimulating the postsynaptic alpha-2 receptors. They mimic noradrenaline and are not dependent on the availability of noradrenaline in the system. They are also unique in that they have no effect on dopaminergic neurotransmission. That then is the basics of how the main ADHD drugs work, with all of them directly influencing neurotransmission in primarily glutamatergic and GABAergic systems through their effects on dopamine and noradrenaline. There are, however, several other issues for us to consider when thinking about the mechanisms of action. While the stimulant medications have a clear time course that's related to availability, that is, the pharmacodynamic effects closely follow the pharmacokinetic profiles, this is not as apparent for atomoxetine and guanfacine. For guanfacine, the 24-hour duration of action may, at least in part, be explained by the extended release formulation and the fact that after a few days, the drug is in what we call steady state, always available to the brain. However, there may be other explanations. Guanfacine is not effective immediately, and it generally takes a few weeks to establish full clinical effect. It's also the case that the effects of guanfacine seem to take longer to wear off than one would expect from the pharmacokinetics and the mechanism of action that I've already described. There may therefore be longer-term effects on the brain. There is in fact some evidence from animal models to suggest that in mice and rats at least, longer-term exposure to guanfacine increases the length and density of dendritic spines. For atomoxetine, there's also a prolonged duration of action, a delayed onset of action, and a slow offset of action when medication is stopped. And again, there's evidence from animal studies to show that atomoxetine is associated with changes in gene expression and protein synthesis that are implicated in neurotransmission, and that there may also be some neurogenesis, the development of new neurons associated with chronic exposure to atomoxetine. While these data have not been replicated in human studies, they may help us understand why the non-stimulant medications have some potential advantages for certain patients and certain situations. So just to summarize and bring together the information from what I know has been quite a complicated description of how these medications work. The stimulants and the non-stimulants both have an effect on dopamine and noradrenaline. They increase the efficiency of neurotransmission across a wide range of important brain circuits that are involved in ADHD, while the stimulants all have a short duration of effect that wears off at the end of each day. The non-stimulants, atomoxetine, guanfacine and clonidine, have a longer duration of effect. And this may be related to additional mechanisms of action that actually involve changes in the way in which the brain is structured and organized. We've still got a lot to learn about how these medications work and how they work differently in different people. But I hope that that has helped understand the basic mechanisms of action and why there are differences between each of these 4 different medications.